Father weighed flour and his own girl to scale, 3 nights in a mountain bed, one name ruined, so he sold her to a wolf hunter like bad stock, and now the town wants change back in the blood of her husband. When the next frontier yarn rolls out on Dusty Trail Stories, listen close, leave your mark in the comments, and swear yourself to that subscribe. The year was 1888, during a season that the elders of the Wyoming Territory would later speak of only in hushed, fearful tones. It was late November, and the biting cold had already settled deep into the bones of the frontier settlement of Bitter Creek. Life here was governed by 2 absolute authorities, the unyielding frost and the merciless moral code of a society that saw sin in every shadow. For Abigail Turner, the air inside her father's trading post usually offered a brief respite from the biting wind, if not from the prying eyes of the town. The shop smelled of ground coffee, raw timber, and the dust of dry goods, a scent that Abigail tried to associate with order and safety. She moved behind the counter with the practiced efficiency of a woman who knows she is being watched, aligning tin cans of peaches with the edge of the shelf, the rhythmic clinking sounds creating a fragile barrier against the world outside. The sunlight filtered through the frosted glass, casting a soft, hazy glow over the dust motes dancing in the air, painting a picture of domestic tranquility that Abigail almost allowed herself to believe in. But the bell above the heavy oak door chimed, a sharp, intrusive sound that shattered the illusion instantly. It was not the wind. 3 men stumbled in, bringing with them a violent gust of freezing air and the heavy, cloying stench of stale whiskey and unwashed bodies. They were trappers, men who spent months in the wilderness and returned with souls as calloused as their hands. They were regulars at the back bar, a place of vice that cast a long, dark shadow over Abigail's reputation simply by proximity. One of them, a towering figure with a jagged scar running through his upper lip, leaned over the counter, his gaze dropping to her bodice with a familiarity that made her skin crawl. The warmth of the room vanished, replaced by a suffocating tension. He whispered something to his companions, a coarse jest about the price of goods and the price of a woman's virtue, loud enough for the others to laugh. The sound scraped against Abigail's nerves like a rusty blade. She glanced toward the back room, praying for her father's intervention, but the heavy curtain remained still. She was alone. The walls of the shop, once her sanctuary, suddenly felt like the sides of a closing coffin. The man with the scar reached out, his dirty fingers grazing the sleeve of her dress, and asked if she came with the whiskey. Panic, cold and sharp, spiked in her chest. She could not breathe. Her hands, slick with fear, fumbled with a sack of flour she had been attempting to move. It slipped from her grasp and hit the floorboards with a dull thud, exploding in a white puff that clouded the air like smoke. The men roared with laughter, a sound that chased away the last of her composure. Without a word, without a coat, driven by a blind instinct to escape the suffocation of their judgment, Abigail turned and ran. She burst through the heavy oak door into the street, seeking air, seeking escape. But the world she stepped into had changed. The sky had turned a bruised, ominous purple, and the wind was no longer a breeze but a scream. The great white storm had arrived, and within seconds, the familiar buildings of Bitter Creek were swallowed by a blinding, suffocating wall of white snow, erasing the road, the town, and her way back home. The wind did not merely blow, it possessed a physical weight, a crushing force that slammed against the rough-hewn logs of the cabin as if demanding entry. Inside, the world was reduced to the circle of light cast by the dying embers in the hearth, but Elias Vance was not looking at the fire. He was looking at the bundle of wet wool and velvet he had just dragged across his threshold. He had found her less than 1 mile from his door, a dark smudge in a universe of blinding white, already half buried by the relentless drifts. Now, safely inside, the danger had shifted from the external fury of the storm to the silent, creeping killer of the cold that had already claimed residence in her marrow. She was not shivering, that was the sign that terrified him the most. Her stillness was absolute, her skin the color of old parchment, her lips a shocking shade of violet. Elias knew the wilderness better than he knew the scriptures, and he knew that the heavy, sodden layers of her city clothes were no longer protection but a shroud, sucking the last vestiges of heat from her core. He knelt beside the cot, his movements driven by a frantic, clinical necessity that left no room for the proprieties of the valley below. The fire needed to roar, and he fed it split logs of seasoned pine until the flames licked high up the chimney, casting long, dancing shadows against the walls. The heat began to build, a wall of warmth that pressed against the chill, but it was not enough. He turned back to the woman. Her name, he knew, was Abigail Turner, the storekeeper's daughter, but in this moment, she had no name, no station, and no history. She was simply a life fading, a candle guttering in a draught. Elias pulled a knife from his belt, the steel glinting in the firelight. His hands, usually steady when dressing a stag, trembled slightly as he reached for the laces of her boots. They were frozen solid, fused with ice, and he had to cut the leather away, peeling the stiff material from her feet which were terrifyingly pale and cold to the touch. He worked his way up, his jaw set in a grim line. The propriety that governed the town of Bitter Creek would demand he avert his eyes, that he leave her modesty intact even at the cost of her life, but the code of the mountain was harsher and more honest. Wet wool was death. He sliced through the heavy outer cloak, the fabric parting with a wet tearing sound. Beneath it, the layers of petticoats were soaked through, heavy as lead. He cut them away, tossing the sodden heaps into the corner where they landed with a heavy slap. With every layer he removed, the vulnerability of her situation became more stark. Finally, she lay before him, stripped of the armor of her civilization, clad only in the thin, damp chemise that clung to her skin like a second layer of frost. He hesitated for only a heartbeat, the weight of the taboo pressing down on him, before he steeled himself. He peeled the final garment from her shoulders, leaving her bare against the rough furs of his bedding. The sight of her was not an invitation, it was an accusation of fragility. He grabbed a rough woolen blanket, warmed by the fire, and wrapped her tightly, creating a cocoon to trap whatever heat she had left. But the blanket was not enough. He needed to drive the blood back into her extremities before the frost took her fingers and toes. Elias sat on the edge of the cot and took her feet into his large, calloused hands. He began to rub them, not with a lover's gentleness, but with a friction that bordered on violence, desperate to spark the fire of circulation. He worked his way up to her hands, chafing her skin, his own body heat radiating toward her. The cabin was filled with the sound of the storm outside and the heavy rhythm of his own breathing. Minutes stretched into an hour. The fire crackled, spitting sparks, and the air in the small room grew heavy and thick with heat. Slowly, agonizingly, the color began to return. A flush of pink crept into her cheeks, replacing the deathly pallor. Then came the first sound, a ragged, gasping inhalation that sounded like a sob. Abigail's eyes fluttered open, unfocused and wild, darting around the dim interior before locking onto his face. Consciousness returned to her in fragments of pain and confusion. The thawing of her frozen limbs brought a searing agony, a sensation like 1,000 needles piercing her skin. She tried to pull away, to curl into a ball, but the heavy blankets constrained her. Then, the realization hit her. The sensation of the rough wool against her bare skin was unmistakable. The memory of the storm, the fall, and the cold collided with the present reality of the heat and the man looming over her. She looked down, seeing her bare shoulder, then looked at the pile of ruined, wet clothes in the corner. Her eyes widened in horror, the shame hitting her harder than the cold ever had. She scrambled backward, clutching the blanket to her throat, her teeth chattering violently. Elias stopped rubbing her hands and sat back, his expression unreadable in the flickering light. He did not apologize, he did not look away. He simply watched her, ensuring that the life he had dragged back from the edge was going to stay. The silence that stretched between them was thick with the unspoken. In the town of Bitter Creek, a woman seen in such a state by a man not her husband was considered spoiled goods, her reputation incinerated. Abigail stared at him, her breath hitching in her throat, realizing that while he had saved her life, he had just witnessed the destruction of her world. The heat of the fire pressed against her skin, but inside, a new kind of cold began to settle, the chilling certainty that she could never go back to who she was before the snow fell. She was alive, breathing and burning with returning blood, but she was trapped in a hunter's cabin with a man who had seen her stripped of everything, while outside, the white curtain of the storm sealed them into a private, terrifying intimacy. The storm finally broke on the morning of the fourth day, leaving the world scoured clean and buried under a shroud of blinding, diamond dust white. The silence that lay over the Wyoming territory was absolute, a heavy stillness that felt less like peace and more like a held breath waiting for judgment. For Abigail Turner, the walk back to Bitter Creek was not a journey of salvation, but a march toward the scaffold. She walked behind Elias Vance, stepping into the deep, churned troughs, his boots carved through the drifts, her head bowed against the glare of the sun that reflected mercilessly off the snow. She wore her own clothes, dried by the fire but stiff with water stains and wrinkled like old skin, a physical testament to her ordeal. Elias did not speak. He moved with the grim determination of a man clearing a path through hell, his rifle slung over one shoulder, his eyes scanning the horizon not for predators, but for the prying eyes of men. Every step closer to civilization tightened the knot of dread in Abigail's stomach. In the cabin, amidst the heat and the raw survival, the laws of man had been suspended. Out here, under the open sky, they returned with crushing weight. They entered the town just past noon. Bitter Creek was digging itself out, men with shovels tossing heavy loads of snow from the boardwalks, their breath pluming in the frigid air. The rhythmic scraping of metal against wood ceased the moment the pair came into view. One by one, heads turned. The silence rippled down the main street, faster than the wind, until the only sound was the crunch of Elias's boots and the dragging of Abigail's hem in the slush. She felt the gaze of the town like a physical blow, a collective, searing brand of scrutiny. There was no joy in their faces, no relief that the lost sheep had been found. There was only the dark, hungry calculation of scandal. They looked at her disheveled hair, the missing buttons on her coat, and then at the rough, solitary man who walked beside her. The arithmetic of their morality was simple and brutal: 3 nights alone in the wilderness equaled a virtue lost beyond retrieval. Whispers began to hiss from the doorways, words like ruined and fallen drifting on the air like ash. Elias did not flinch, his jaw set in granite, but Abigail shrank in on herself, wishing the snow would rise up and swallow her whole. When they reached the trading post, the bell above the door chimed, the same cheerful, tinny sound that had signaled her flight days ago, now sounding like a funeral toll. The shop was warm, smelling of sawdust and tobacco. Her father, Thomas Turner, stood behind the counter, his face gray and haggard. When he saw them, relief washed over his features for a fleeting second, only to be instantly replaced by a purple, vein-throbbing rage. He did not rush to embrace her. He did not call for a doctor. He looked past her, his eyes locking onto Elias with a mixture of fear and accusation. He came around the counter, his movements stiff. "You brought her back," he said, his voice flat, devoid of gratitude. It was a statement, not a question. Elias nodded once, his expression unreadable. "Alive," Elias replied, the single word carrying a weight that filled the room. Thomas Turner looked at his daughter then, really looked at her, and Abigail saw something break in his eyes. He did not see his child, he saw damaged inventory. He saw the whispers that were already curling under the doorframe. 3 nights, Thomas muttered, his hands gripping the edge of a barrel until his knuckles turned white. "The town knows. They saw you come in. They've been talking since the storm started." Abigail opened her mouth to speak, to explain the cold, the fire, the innocent necessity of survival, but her father silenced her with a sharp cutting motion of his hand. "It does not matter what happened," he hissed, his voice trembling with the terrifying logic of reputation. "It matters what they think happened. No decent man in this territory will touch you now. The Turner name, my business." He trailed off, the selfish calculation of his loss hanging in the air. The solution he proposed was not born of love, but of a desperate need to plug a leak in his social standing. He looked at Elias, sizing him up not as a savior, but as the only available option to cover the stain. "You'll marry her," Thomas said, the command dropping like a stone. "Today. Now. Before the sun sets and the talk turns to bastards." Elias looked at the older man, his eyes narrowing. There was no greed in Elias's face, no desire for this woman he hardly knew, but he looked at Abigail, shivering, humiliated, tears cutting tracks through the grime on her face, and saw that her father would cast her out if he refused. The wilderness had been cruel, but this room was cruel in a way that made the wolves seem merciful. "If she'll have me," Elias said quietly, his voice a low rumble that vibrated in the tense room. The ceremony took place an hour later in the drafty parlor of the parsonage, a room that smelled of dust and old Bibles. The Reverend, a man with a face like a dried apple and eyes devoid of charity, performed the rites with the haste of a man disposing of something unpleasant. There were no flowers, no guests, no music. The only witnesses were the store clerk and the Reverend's sour-faced wife, who watched with arms crossed, her judgment radiating like heat from a stove. Abigail stood stiffly in a borrowed dress that was too loose in the waist, the fabric hanging on her like a sack. She felt numb, detached, as if watching a stranger being sentenced to prison. When the time came, Elias produced a ring, not gold, but a simple band of iron he had likely fashioned for a trap chain or a tool handle. It was cold and hard as he slipped it onto her finger. It was heavy. "With this ring, I thee wed," he murmured, and for the first time, he looked directly into her eyes. In that moment, the room faded. She saw no mockery in his gaze, only a solemn, terrifying promise. He was taking a burden onto his shoulders, accepting the scorn of the town to shield her from it. "I pronounce you man and wife," the Reverend droned, closing his book with a final, dismissive thump. "What God has joined, let no man put asunder." The words felt like the closing of a cell door. There was no kiss. To do so in front of these people would have felt like a performance for an audience that only wanted to jeer. Thomas Turner exhaled, a sound of immense tension leaving his body, and handed the Reverend a few coins, the price of his daughter's respectability. He turned to Abigail, but he could not meet her eyes. "It's done," he said, washing his hands of the affair. "You should go. Before the snow starts again." They left the parsonage and walked back out into the biting cold. The sun was dipping low, painting the sky in violent shades of orange and blood red. Elias did not lead her back to the trading post to collect her things, there was nothing there for her anymore. Her life in Bitter Creek, the life of ribbons and ledgers and tea in the afternoon, had been amputated. He helped her up onto the seat of a buckboard wagon he had hitched earlier, his hands firm but respectful. As he climbed up beside her and took the reins, the townsfolk watched from their windows, silhouettes of judgment against the glass. They had expected a tragedy, but they had been given a scandal, and they would feast on it for years. Elias snapped the reins, and the horses lurched forward, pulling them away from the town, away from her father, and back toward the dark, towering tree line of the mountains. Abigail looked down at the iron ring on her hand. It was ugly, crude, and indestructible. As the town of Bitter Creek faded behind them, shrinking into the vast whiteness of the frontier, she realized she was afraid, not of the man sitting silently beside her, but of the strange, uncharted vastness of the life that lay ahead. She was Mrs. Elias Vance now, a woman bound to a stranger in the wild, possessed by a debt she could never repay and a husband she did not know. Winter tightened its grip upon the high country of the Wyoming Territory, transforming the cabin into a solitary island in a vast, frozen sea. The world beyond the frosted windowpanes ceased to exist, reduced to a blinding white expanse where the wind scoured the earth and the timber wolves sang their mournful, hungry songs to the moon. For Abigail, the first weeks of her marriage were defined not by the warmth of affection, but by a silence so profound it seemed to have weight and texture. The cabin was a small universe, yet she and Elias Vance orbited one another like wary planets, bound by the gravity of their vows but kept apart by a chasm of unfamiliarity. The days were consumed by the brutal, repetitive drudgery of survival, a sharp departure from the measured, mercantile life she had known behind the counter of her father's store. Here, there were no ledgers to balance, only the relentless accounting of wood against the cold, and food against the hunger. She learned that a man's life in the wilderness was a constant war against the elements, and now, it was her war too. She learned to skin a rabbit without flinching at the warmth of its blood, to bank a fire so that the embers would hold until dawn, and to melt snow for water until her hands were raw and chapped. Elias was a diligent provider, a man of iron discipline who rose before the sun and returned only when the light failed, often carrying the carcass of a deer or a string of grouse. He spoke little, his words rationed like sugar, offered only when necessary. "Wood's low," he would say, or "storm's coming." He treated her with a stiff, formal courtesy that was almost more painful than cruelty would have been. He was not unkind, but he was distant, a stranger who shared her meals and, in the darkest hours of the night, her bed. That narrow bed in the corner became the focal point of her anxiety. They slept side by side, stiff as corpses, separated by a distinct line of invisible demarcation. She could feel the heat radiating from his large frame, a temptation in the freezing dark, but neither dared to bridge the gap. They were husband and wife in the eyes of the church and the law, but in the quiet of the cabin, they were two castaways sharing a raft, terrified that a sudden movement might capsize them both. It was in the third week of their confinement that the weather turned from harsh to murderous. This was not the soft, suffocating blanket of the white storm that had brought them together, this was an ice storm, a violent, shrieking tempest that coated the world in a heavy, glass-like armor. The wind did not howl, it screamed, battering the logs of the cabin with the force of a battering ram. Inside, the air grew heavy with the smoke that the wind forced back down the chimney, stinging their eyes and adding to the claustrophobia. They ate their supper of stewed venison in tense silence, the only sound the clattering of spoons and the groaning of the timber frame around them. Suddenly, a sound like a gunshot cracked through the room, louder than the wind, louder than the fire. Dust and bark rained down from the ceiling. Elias was on his feet in an instant, his eyes darting upward. The main ridge beam, a massive trunk of pine that held the weight of the roof against the mounting snow and ice, had fractured. A dark, jagged split ran along its length, and under the screaming assault of the wind, the roof was beginning to sag. If the beam failed, the roof would collapse, burying them in tons of timber and snow, leaving them exposed to a night that would kill them in minutes. "The brace," Elias shouted, his voice cutting through Abigail's paralysis. "Get the bracing timber from the lean-to." There was no time for fear, no time for the propriety of gender roles. Abigail scrambled, throwing open the heavy door. The wind hit her like a physical blow, knocking the breath from her lungs, the ice pellets stinging her face like buckshot. She fought her way to the woodpile, dragging a heavy, rough-hewn post back into the cabin. Elias was already climbing onto the table, his shoulders straining as he pushed upward against the sagging ceiling, his face a mask of supreme effort. "Wedge it," he roared, sweat beading on his forehead despite the cold. "Under the split. Now." Abigail heaved the post upright. It was heavy, far heavier than the sacks of flour she used to complain about, but adrenaline lent her a strength she did not know she possessed. She jammed the base of the timber against the floorboards and guided the top under the fracturing beam, right where Elias's hands were holding back the weight of the roof. "Push," he grunted, his muscles trembling with the strain. Together, they drove the brace into place, Abigail using the handle of the axe to hammer the base until it stood vertical, taking the load. The groaning of the roof eased, replaced by the steady, creaking resistance of the new support. They did not stop there. For the next 2 hours, as the storm raged with apocalyptic fury outside, they worked in a frenzy to reinforce the structure. They lashed additional supports, nailed cross beams with freezing fingers, and stuffed rags into the gaps where the mortar had cracked. They moved around each other not as strangers, but as a single, functioning unit. There was no room for please or, thank you, only the shorthand of survival, a grunt, a gesture, a shared look of understanding. Abigail held the lantern high while Elias hammered, the light casting wild shadows on his face, illuminating the fierce concentration in his eyes. She saw the way the muscles in his back bunched and coiled through his shirt, the sheer, raw power of the man she had married. And he saw her, not as the delicate shopkeeper's daughter, but as a woman with soot on her face and blood on her knuckles, holding the line against the dark. When the work was finally done, when the roof held firm against the wind's assault, the adrenaline that had sustained them began to ebb, leaving in its wake a trembling exhaustion. They collapsed onto the fur rug before the hearth, gasping for air, their bodies slick with sweat that rapidly cooled in the drafty room. The fire had burned low. Elias reached out to add a log, his hand shaking slightly. As he sat back, his shoulder brushed against hers. In the past, she would have pulled away, retreated to her side of the invisible line. But tonight, the line was gone. The nearness of death had stripped away the artifice of their arrangement. They were alive. The realization was a heady, intoxicating rush. Abigail looked at him, really looked at him, her chest heaving. She saw the relief in his eyes, but behind it, she saw something else, a dark, smoldering intensity that mirrored the heat rising in her own blood. The physical exertion had awakened something primal in both of them, a need to affirm life in the face of the frozen void outside. The silence that fell between them now was not the awkward silence of strangers, it was the charged, electric silence of a match hovering over dry kindling. Elias turned to her, his gaze dropping to her lips, then to the pulse fluttering wildly in her throat. He reached out, his hand rough and calloused, and traced the line of her jaw. It was a question, unspoken but loud as a shout. Abigail did not flinch. Instead, a sudden, overwhelming wave of desire crashed over her, a rejection of the cold, a rejection of the shame, a desperate need for warmth and connection. She leaned into his touch, her eyes fluttering shut. Elias, she whispered, and the sound of his name on her lips seemed to snap the last tether of his restraint. He pulled her to him, not with the polite hesitation of a gentleman, but with the hunger of a starving man. His mouth found hers, hot and demanding, tasting of wood smoke and salt. It was a collision, a chaotic tangle of limbs and shedding of heavy wool. The firelight danced over their skin as the barriers of cloth were discarded, leaving them bare to the heat and to each other. There was no gentleness in their union that night, no whispered endearments or practiced romance. It was fierce and urgent, a reclaiming of territory. Elias moved over her with a power that should have been frightening but was instead exhilarating. He was the storm, and she was the earth receiving it. Abigail met him with a ferocity of her own, her nails digging into his shoulders, anchoring herself to him as the only solid thing in a spinning world. In the friction of their bodies, in the shared breath and the tangled sheets, the shame of the town, the judgment of her father, and the fear of the future were incinerated. They were no longer two people forced together by circumstance, they were bound by the shared trauma of survival and the undeniable, magnetic truth of their bodies. As the storm continued to batter the walls of their sanctuary, they forged a new covenant in the firelight, not one written in a church registry, but one written in sweat and the frantic, life-affirming rhythm of their blood. When the fire finally died down to embers, leaving them entangled and breathless in the cooling dark, Abigail knew that the woman who had walked into this cabin was gone. She had been forged into something new, something stronger, tempered by the ice and the fire of Elias Vance. Chapter 4 ended not with the silence of distance, but with the silence of peace, as for the first time, she fell asleep with her head resting on his chest, listening to the steady, strong beat of his heart against her ear. The thaw did not arrive with a gentle whisper, as the poets in the eastern cities might have described it, but with the groaning of the earth waking from a long, frozen coma. It was mid-March of 1889, and the sun had begun to linger longer in the sky, its pale light finally carrying enough warmth to soften the iron grip of the drifts. The sound of the world changed, the high, keening wail of the wind was replaced by the relentless, dripping rhythm of melting ice. Water ran in rivulets down the logs of the cabin, staining the wood dark, and the creek, silent for months under a tomb of ice, began to murmur and crack. Inside the cabin, a similar thaw had taken hold, a softening of the jagged edges that had defined the early weeks of the marriage between Elias and Abigail Vance. The intimacy of the ice storm had not been a fleeting aberration, but a breaking of the dam. The silence that filled the room in the evenings was no longer a wall, but a bridge. They moved through their days with a synchronized rhythm, a domestic choreography learned through necessity and perfected by a growing, unspoken regard. Abigail no longer flinched when Elias passed close to her near the hearth. Instead, she found herself leaning almost imperceptibly toward his warmth. Elias, for his part, had begun to bring her small, rough offerings from his treks, a stone of unusual color from the creek bed, a handful of early spruce tips for tea, gestures that spoke louder than any sonnet he could have recited. But the wilderness of the Wyoming Territory was a jealous master, and it did not look kindly upon comfort. The season of the thaw was also the season of the hunger. The winter had been long and merciless, and the creatures of the forest had been pushed to the very brink of starvation. The deer were gaunt, their ribs pressing against their hides like the staves of a barrel, and the predators that hunted them were mad with the kind of desperation that erases fear. On a Tuesday morning, with the sky a brilliant, deceptive blue, Abigail ventured out to the clearing. The air was crisp, smelling of wet pine needles and the damp, musky scent of mud, a perfume that felt intoxicating after months of breathing recycled smoke and dust. She carried a basket of linens, heavy woolen shirts and the cotton sheets from their bed, that she had boiled in the large copper kettle over the fire. The domesticity of the task felt like a victory, a reclaiming of civilization in the heart of the wild. She moved to the line Elias had strung between two sturdy aspen trees, the wet fabric steaming in the cold air as she pinned it up. She hummed a melody she remembered from the piano in her father's parlor, a tune that felt like it belonged to another life, another woman. The sun felt good on her face, and for a moment, she allowed herself to close her eyes, tilting her head back to drink in the light. It was this moment of peace, this lapse in vigilance, that nearly cost her everything. The silence broke not with a roar, but with a low, guttural vibration that she felt in her chest before she heard it with her ears. The birds, she realized with a jolt of ice-cold terror, had stopped singing. Abigail lowered the wet sheet she had been holding, the heavy fabric clapping against her legs, and turned slowly toward the tree line. They were there, standing in the shadows of the spruce like specters conjured from the gray mist. 3 of them. Timber wolves, but massive, their frames exaggerated by the ragged state of their winter coats. They were not the noble beasts of storybooks, they were nightmares of bone and sinew, their eyes yellow and flat, fixed on her with a singular, terrifying intent. The leader, a brute with a torn ear and a patch of mange on his flank, took a step forward, his paws sinking into the slushy snow. His lips curled back to reveal teeth that looked too long, yellowed and sharp as daggers. He did not growl, he simply watched her, calculating the distance, measuring the prey. Abigail stood frozen, the basket slipping from her numb fingers to tumble into the snow. She knew she should scream, she knew she should run, but the primitive brain stem reaction to a predator paralyzed her. She was not a woman in that moment, she was meat. Elias. The scream finally tore from her throat, ragged and high, shattering the stillness of the clearing. The reaction of the pack was instantaneous. The leader dropped low and launched himself forward, a gray blur of muscle and hunger covering the ground with terrifying speed. The other 2 flanked him, moving to cut off her retreat to the cabin. Abigail scrambled backward, her boots slipping in the mud, her hands grasping for anything, a branch, a stone, but there was nothing. The wolf was 20 feet away, then 10. She could smell him now, a stench of rot and wet fur. She threw her arms up to protect her face, bracing for the tearing of flesh, closing her eyes as the shadow leaped. The crack of the rifle was deafening, a thunderclap that seemed to split the very air. The lead wolf twisted in mid-air, yelping as a heavy slug caught it in the shoulder, spinning it around to crash into the slush. But the momentum of the pack was not so easily broken. The second wolf, undeterred by the noise, lunged for Abigail's leg. She kicked out, her boot connecting with a hard skull, but the beast snapped its jaws, teeth catching the heavy wool of her skirt and dragging her down. She hit the ground hard, the cold seeping instantly into her clothes. "Get back!" Elias's voice was a roar, a sound of pure, unadulterated fury. He had burst from the cabin door, the smoking Winchester in one hand and a heavy splitting axe in the other. He did not stop to reload. He charged into the fray, a man possessed. He swung the rifle like a club, the stock connecting with the ribs of the wolf dragging Abigail, hearing the sickening crunch of bone. The beast released her, yelping and scrambling back, but the third wolf, younger, desperate, and blind with hunger, leaped for Elias's throat. Elias dropped the rifle and swung the axe in a tight, vicious arc. The blade missed the killing blow but buried itself deep in the wolf's flank. The animal screamed, a human-like sound that curdled the blood, and thrashed wildly. In its flailing, its jaws clamped down on Elias's left forearm, the teeth sinking through the heavy canvas coat and into the flesh beneath. Elias did not scream. He grunted, a low, guttural sound of impact, and dropped his weight, driving the wolf into the snow. With his free hand, he drew the hunting knife from his belt and drove it down, once, twice, 3 times, until the beast went limp. The remaining wolf, the one with the shattered shoulder, and the one with the broken ribs, turned and fled, vanishing back into the tree line as quickly as they had appeared, leaving behind only blood and the echo of violence. Silence returned to the clearing, but it was a different kind of silence now, heavy, ringing, and smelling of copper. Elias stood over the carcass of the dead wolf, his chest heaving, his breath pluming in great white clouds in the cold air. Blood dripped steadily from his left sleeve, painting bright, shocking crimson flowers on the pristine white snow. He turned to look at Abigail, his eyes wide and dark, the adrenaline still blowing his pupils wide. "Abby," he wheezed, the name tearing out of him. "You hurt?" Abigail scrambled up from the mud, ignoring the trembling in her legs. She rushed to him, her hands hovering over his arm. "Me? No. Elias, your arm, my God, the blood." "It's deep," he admitted, his voice tight with pain as the adrenaline began to fade. He swayed slightly, and Abigail grabbed him, wrapping her arm around his waist to support his weight. He was heavy, a solid wall of man, but fear gave her strength. "Inside," she commanded, her voice surprisingly steady. "We need to get you inside. Now." They stumbled back into the cabin, leaving the carnage in the yard. Abigail kicked the door shut and threw the heavy bolt, barring the world out. She guided Elias to the chair by the fire, pushing him down. The warmth of the room seemed suffocating now, intensifying the metallic smell of the blood that was soaking his coat. Abigail moved with a speed and clarity she had never known she possessed. She went to the cupboard, grabbing the bottle of whiskey and a clean, sharp paring knife. She threw more wood on the fire, not for warmth, but for light. "Coat needs to come off," she said, kneeling beside him. Her hands were covered in his blood, sticky and warm, but she did not flinch. Elias hissed through his teeth as she peeled the heavy canvas away. The sleeve was shredded, and the shirt beneath was sodden. Abigail did not hesitate, she took the knife and sliced the fabric from his wrist to his shoulder, exposing the wound. It was a jagged, ugly tear, the flesh laid open to the bone, weeping blood in a steady pulse. The sight of it made her stomach turn, but she swallowed the bile. This man had walked into a storm for her. He had fought a wolf with his hands for her. She would not faint. "It needs cleaning," Elias rasped, his face pale, beads of sweat standing out on his forehead. "And it needs stitching. Can you do it, Abigail?" I do not think I can do it one-handed." Abigail looked at the wound, then up into his eyes. There was trust there. Absolute, terrifying trust. He was placing his life in her hands, just as he had placed his body between her and the pack. She nodded, her jaw setting in a line that mirrored his own stubbornness. "I can do it," she said. She poured the whiskey over the wound. Elias roared, a sound of agony that he tried to stifle, gripping the arms of the chair until the wood creaked. She did not stop. She washed the blood away, checking for debris, for broken teeth. Then she took the needle she used for mending canvas, threaded it with heavy silk thread, and held it in the flame of the candle until the tip glowed orange. "Hold still," she whispered, placing a hand on his shoulder. "I am sorry, Elias. I am so sorry." "Do it," he breathed, closing his eyes. The next hour was an eternity. Abigail worked with the precision of a seamstress, pulling the jagged edges of the skin together, forcing the needle through the tough muscle. Every time Elias flinched, her own heart skipped a beat, but she did not stop. She spoke to him softly, a stream of nonsense words, prayers, and promises, her voice a low hum against the crackling of the fire. She stitched the violence of the afternoon closed, binding him together with her own hands. When the last knot was tied and the wound was bandaged with strips of boiled linen, Elias slumped back in the chair, exhausted, his face gray but peaceful. Abigail sank to the floor beside him, her beautiful dress ruined with mud and blood, her hands trembling uncontrollably now that the work was done. She rested her head against his knee, the adrenaline crashing out of her system, leaving her weeping silently. Elias reached down with his good hand, his fingers tangling in her hair. The touch was weak, but it was there. "You did good, Abby," he whispered, his voice rough with pain and something else, pride. "You did real good." Abigail looked up at him, tears streaking the dirt on her face. She realized then that the transaction that had taken place in the parsonage was dead. The debt was paid. The blood on her hands was a covenant stronger than any ring. They had both bled for this marriage now. "You saved me," she said, her voice shaking. "You jumped in front of them." Elias managed a weak, lopsided smile, the first she had truly seen on his face. "You my wife, Abigail. That means something out here. We keep each other alive. That's the deal. We keep each other alive," she repeated, the words settling into her soul like a foundation stone. Outside, the sun began to set, casting long purple shadows across the snow where the dead wolf lay stiffening in the cold. But inside the cabin, the fire burned bright and hot. Abigail rose, wiped her face with her apron, and moved to put the kettle on. She was no longer the shopkeeper's daughter who feared the whispers of the town. She was the woman who had stitched a man back together while the wolves howled at the door. She was Mrs. Elias Vance, and as she looked at her husband sleeping in the chair, his chest rising and falling in a steady rhythm, she knew that come hell or high water, come snow or wolves or the judgment of men, they were a pack of two, and they would face the spring together. The descent from the high country was a journey through the throat of the spring thaw, a landscape of weeping earth and rushing waters that seemed to wash away the last gray vestiges of the long winter. It was early May in the year of our Lord 1889, and the world had turned to a riot of mud and new green. The wagon, laden with furs Elias had trapped over the long months, silver fox, beaver, and marten, creaked and groaned as its iron-rimmed wheels sliced through the thick, sucking slush of the mountain road. To any observer watching from the tree line, the couple on the buckboard seat would have presented a picture that defied every expectation of the valley below. They did not look like survivors of a tragedy, they looked like conquerors. Abigail sat upright, her posture no longer the slumped, defeated curve of a woman in disgrace, but the straight-backed silhouette of someone who has faced death and found it wanting. She wore her hair simply, braided back from a face that was tanned by the snow glare and the sun, her skin glowing with a vitality that the pale women of the town could never manufacture with powders or rouges. Beside her, Elias Vance drove the team with an easy confidence, his injured arm, though still stiff, healing well under the poultices Abigail changed daily. The silence between them was no longer a void, it was a warm, living thing, filled with the memory of the firelight and the tacit understanding of two soldiers returning from the same war. Before the town of Bitter Creek came into view, at a bend in the road where the valley floor opened up like a quilt of brown and green, Elias pulled on the reins, bringing the horses to a halt. The sudden stillness was filled with the roar of the swollen river nearby. He reached into the pocket of his heavy canvas coat and pulled out a small object wrapped in a scrap of oilcloth. He handed it to Abigail without ceremony, his eyes fixed on the horizon as if the gesture were nothing of consequence, though the slight tightening of his jaw betrayed him. Abigail unwrapped the cloth to reveal a carving. It was rough-hewn from a piece of seasoned pine, smelling of resin and the sharp steel of his knife. It depicted two figures, barely more than suggestions of form, standing shoulder to shoulder, their roots intertwined at the base as if they were trees growing from the same patch of rocky soil. It was not the work of an artist, but it was the work of a husband. "It is us," he said, his voice low and raspy, the words dropping into the cool air like stones. "So you do not forget. No matter what they say down there." Abigail ran her thumb over the rough wood, feeling the grain, tears pricking her eyes not from sadness, but from a fierce, swelling pride. She tucked the carving into the bodice of her dress, against her heart, and reached out to cover his large, scarred hand with hers. "I will not forget," she promised, and the vow carried more weight than the one she had spoken in the parsonage months ago. They rode into Bitter Creek at high noon. The town was exactly as they had left it, a collection of false-fronted buildings huddled against the mud, drowning in its own smallness. But as the wagon rolled down the main street, the atmosphere shifted. The sound of hammers and casual conversation died away, replaced by a heavy, suffocating silence. People stopped in the boardwalks to stare. They had expected Abigail to return broken, gaunt, perhaps begging for forgiveness or hiding her face in shame. Instead, they saw a woman who looked directly at them, her chin held high, sitting beside the savage of the mountain as if he were a king. The sight did not breed relief, it bred resentment. To the people of Bitter Creek, misery was the only appropriate penance for sin. To see the sinners thriving, to see them healthy and undeniably united, was an insult to the moral order they clung to so desperately. Mrs. Gable, the town gossip, stood outside the millinery, her mouth hanging open, clutching her shawl as if protecting herself from a contagion. Abigail met her gaze and did not look away until the older woman flustered and turned her back. It was a small victory, but it tasted sweet. They pulled up in front of the trading post. The sign above the door, Turner and Son, swung slightly in the breeze, squeaking on a rusty hinge. Elias set the brake and hopped down, moving to help Abigail, but she was already descending, her boots hitting the boardwalk with a solid thump. They walked to the door together, Elias's hand resting lightly on the small of her back, a gesture of possession and protection that did not go unnoticed by the eyes watching from the darkened windows across the street. The bell chimed as they entered, that same cheerful, tinny sound that had bookended Abigail's trauma. The store smelled of stale tobacco, dust, and the sour scent of vinegar, a stark contrast to the clean, sharp air of the high country. Thomas Turner was measuring fabric for a customer, but he froze as the door opened. The customer, a farmer's wife, took one look at Abigail and Elias, gathered her skirts, and hurried out, leaving the bolt of calico unrolled on the counter. Thomas looked at his daughter. He took in her tan skin, the rougher cut of her clothes, and the undeniable strength in her stance. He looked at Elias, whose presence filled the room, dark and formidable. "You back," Thomas said, his voice devoid of warmth. It was an accusation, not a greeting. "I assumed you would stay up there. Where you belong." "We are here to trade," Abigail said, her voice clear and steady, cutting through the dusty air. "We have furs. The finest marten you will see this year. And we need supplies for the spring planting." Her father laughed, a dry, brittle sound. "Planting? You think you can play house in the woods and then come waltzing back in here like nothing happened? Like you are not the shame of this family?" He leaned over the counter, his face twisting with a bitterness that had fermented over the long winter. "Do you have any idea what it has been like? The whispers. The stares. I have lost business, Abigail. Because of you. We are paying customers, Thomas, Elias said, his voice a low rumble. He did not call the man father. We will take the flour, the seed corn, and the nails. And we will pay in coin or trade, whichever you prefer. Thomas sneered, his eyes darting to the door. I do not want your coin. And I certainly do not want your trade. He paused, a cruel glint entering his eyes. But it seems I am not the only one who has been waiting for your return. As if on cue, the heavy oak door swung open behind them. The light from the street was blocked by the silhouette of Sheriff Coleman, a man with a paunch and a face that spoke of small power wielded with great pleasure. Behind him stood two deputies, their hands resting on the butts of their revolvers. The air in the shop turned instantly cold. Elias stiffened, his instincts screaming, his hand twitching toward the knife at his belt, but he stopped himself. To draw a weapon here would be a death sentence. Elias Vance, the sheriff said, stepping into the room, the floorboards creaking under his weight. You are under arrest. Abigail spun around, placing herself between Elias and the lawmen. Arrest? For what? Being absent from town? There is no law against surviving a storm. The sheriff smiled, a slow, ugly expression that showed yellowed teeth. Not for the storm, Mrs. Vance. Though the good Lord knows that was crime enough against decency. He pulled a folded piece of paper from his pocket. New evidence has come to light regarding the fire at the Vance homestead. 5 years ago. The fire that killed your parents and your brother. He looked at Elias, his eyes gleaming with malice. We have a witness who claims it was not an accident. Claims they saw you setting the kindling. Murder, Vance. 3 counts. And arson. That is a lie. Abigail screamed, the sound tearing from her throat. He was a boy. He loved them. He nearly died trying to save them. She looked at her father, seeing the smug satisfaction on his face, and the realization hit her with the force of a physical blow. This was a trap. A orchestrated dismantling of the man who had defied their judgment. They could not hang him for marrying her, so they would hang him for something else. Father, tell them. You know the truth. Everyone knows it was a chimney fire. Thomas Turner looked at his fingernails, refusing to meet her eyes. I know that a man capable of ruining a decent woman is capable of anything, Abigail. The law must take its course. Sheriff Coleman stepped forward, unhooking a pair of heavy iron handcuffs from his belt. Easy way or the hard way, mountain man. Makes no difference to me. But if you fight, the girl gets hurt in the scuffle. That's a guarantee. Elias looked at the deputies, whose hands were white-knuckled on their guns. He looked at Abigail, her face pale with terror, her hands clutching his sleeve. He knew the truth. He knew there was no witness. He knew this was the town exerting its will, crushing the outlier to restore its own twisted sense of order. If he fought, they would shoot him down right here, and Abigail would be caught in the crossfire. He looked into her eyes, seeing the panic rising, and he forced a calm onto his face that he did not feel. It's all right, Abby, he said softly, his voice steady. No, she sobbed, pulling at his coat. You see not go with them. They'll kill you, Elias. They'll kill you. I have to, he whispered, reaching out to brush a stray lock of hair from her forehead with his thumb. Do not fight them. You survive. You hear me? You survive. He gently peeled her fingers from his arm, a gesture that felt like tearing his own heart out. He turned to the sheriff and held out his wrists. Take me. The cold iron clicked shut with a sound of finality that echoed through the store. The deputies grabbed him roughly, shoving him toward the door. Elias did not look back. He walked with his head high, refusing to give them the satisfaction of seeing him struggle. As they dragged him out into the bright, blinding sunlight of the street, the townspeople watched in silence, their faces masks of self-righteous satisfaction. They had won. The beast was chained. Abigail ran to the door, but her father caught her arm, his grip bruising. "Let him go, Abigail," he hissed. "It's over. You can come home now. We can fix this. We can send you east, to your aunt. You can start over." Abigail stopped struggling. She stood in the open doorway, watching the wagon loaded with their furs, the furs that were supposed to build their future, standing unattended in the mud. She watched the sheriff marching her husband toward the jailhouse, a brick building that looked like a tomb. She felt the wooden carving pressing against her skin, hard and unyielding. Slowly, she turned to look at her father. The man who had raised her. The man who had just sold her husband to the hangman to save his own pride. She looked at his hand on her arm as if it were a poisonous spider. With a violent, deliberate motion, she shoved him away. "Home," she said, her voice shaking with a cold, terrible rage. "I have no home here. You speak of him as a savage. You are the savages. All of you." She stepped out onto the boardwalk, ignoring his calls. She did not run after Elias, she knew the jailhouse doors were already barred. She stood alone in the center of the muddy street, under the vast, indifferent sky of the Wyoming Territory. The wind picked up, carrying the scent of pine from the distant mountains, a cruel reminder of the freedom she had tasted. The tears finally spilled over, hot and scalding, but she did not collapse. She stood straight, her hands balled into fists at her sides, realizing with a shattering clarity that the storm in the mountains had been mercy. The wolves had been honest. The cold had been clean. This civilization, with its laws and its lies and its polite cruelty, this was the true wilderness. And as the sun beat down on the empty street, Abigail Vance swore that she would burn it all down before she let them break her again.